So today we have Emilia. Emilia, what's your... Okay, I'm gonna go straight to the question.
Okay,
What's
I'm
your
nervous.
MBTI personality?
My MBTI?
Yeah, a lot of people put this on LinkedIn or
oh
they
my
will put it on their
God.
email signature, right?
This is a hot take, but I feel like the MBTI personality is the Gen Z version of astrology.
Okay.
But to humor you, I am an ENFJ, and all of the times that I've taken the test, and I've taken it quite a few times,
Okay.
it's always come up as ENFJ. But I think people like the MBTIs and astrology and all of these things because people naturally want to know themselves better, and people like patterns. So there are certain traits of an ENFJ that I resonate with and some that really don't. So I much prefer people address me as a Capricorn rather than an ENFJ.
Right.
Yeah.
For the sake of this.
Yeah.
All right, got it.
Cool.
Hello, I'm Sabrina. Welcome to Tarik Talks. This is a Malaysian podcast brought to you by the people behind Malaysia's tech ecosystem. So if you're curious about Malaysia's tech scene, or you want to know about the people behind them, or you're exploring your new path and trying to hear real stories from others, come and grab your cup and come and join us.
Cool.
I think it's interesting that you relate to some traits.
Yeah.
Because I think that I read that ENFJ.
Ooh, tell me what you know about ENFJs.
They tend to be vocal about their values. So I think that is kind of true. That's
Yeah.
what I see that in
A little
you.
bit.
Yeah. For me, I am an INFP.
Ooh.
So sometimes an ENFP. I guess it
Okay.
depends.
Okay.
But
I get that.
one other interesting thing also, we take MBTIs with a grain of salt because they're just heuristic. They're not critically backed or science
Not
backed.
peer reviewed.
Yeah. But based on what research papers have claimed, a lot of people in tech or computer engineers specifically, they tend to be the NTs or the analytical and the thinking type.
Yeah.
But anyways.
Anyway.
I do think that we're seeing a bit more of a diverse mix.
For sure.
But today, what I would like to talk about with you is, do you remember that you wrote me this very cute card?
Oh my God.
And
I think you need to show the camera what it says in the front. It
Okay.
says exceeding
exceeding.
expectations.
Okay. You mentioned that we have collectively created a place where you felt supported, where humor and play was embraced, and ultimately a place where you felt safe to be your truest self.
Yeah, and that comes from the heart. I really meant that.
I know. And when I read that, I felt very honored, and I
Yeah.
feel very grateful to you too, because I know that it would not have been possible had we not collectively encouraged that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
today I'd like to talk to you about what exactly makes such an environment and what impact does it bring to the team or to the work when that happens.
Cool. Let's do it.
Okay.
Okay.
So, Emilia, you have been in a number of highly technical roles. You were an engineer in a global network intelligence company. You have designed and implemented systems on Linux. You're also a data resiliency lead, ensuring that critical data pipelines don't break. So throughout all of these experiences, right, do you think that technical teams have a certain mold? Have you seen any sort of archetypes?
Yeah. It's really weird hearing you say that because I've never really grown up to imagine myself as like an engineer. I'm a very like creative and expressive person, and that's not really like traits that people associate with engineers per se. But what I do realize, and my opinion is very KL-centric, because this is where I've built my career. But what I've noticed is that people tend to look for people who are very linear thinking, people who are very analytical. So when you ask about like what kind of mold that I've seen, that's generally what people look for when they're hiring engineers. But I think if you look at it globally, at like the bigger picture, all of these like savant types, very like technical people.
Yeah.
have kind of built these ecosystems that aren't really ideal in its current state. Because, like, for example, we all are addicted to our smartphones. Like, there are chatbots that are inducing psychosis in mentally vulnerable people. And, like, there's also, all of these tech giants really, like, obviously manipulating actual politics. So I think it's kind of time that we explore and experiment other personality types, other archetypes for technical roles. Because I don't see the harm, like, we've seen what a certain type of persona does to the tech ecosystem. So, like, why not try something else and see what happens, right? Like, how much worse could it be?
No, we're not hoping for it to go worse. But, okay. But so you do see that there is certain archetypes, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever tried to fit into that mold?
Okay,
And
yeah.
what did that look like day to day?
I did really, really, because when I first started out, I knew that I didn't really fit in per se, because like a lot of majority of my colleagues were men. So like I would go in meetings and I would like, first of all, I would speak in a deeper voice. I'd be like, good morning, everyone. This is the, and then I'd like, one trick that I did was I would raise my chair so that at meetings, I would be eye level with all of these men. Yeah, so that I'd be eye level. I stopped wearing skirts. I stopped making jokes. I really tried hard to be what I thought people would think of as a good engineer, but it kind of like burnt me out after a little bit because I had to maintain this facade and I also had to do the work. So it was like a double whammy sort of situation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard because you have to do the work and you have to do the work of.
You have to be conscious of like how you're being perceived.
Yeah.
Which is really difficult, It's like you're method acting at work. Yeah.
I think I can relate to that because when I first started working, I didn't really know how to act. I wasn't so sure, like, could I show a little bit of personality here and there? But was there a point in your career where you stopped doing that? Or where you started to lean a little bit more on your personality?
Yeah. So, like, I think the pandemic, weirdly enough, really helped with this personality hang-up that I had. Because when I started my current job, everything was online.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to deal with being in physical spaces with other people. That sounds bad, but I promise you it's not.
It's okay.
I didn't really have to maintain this persona. And when we came back into the office, people had already known me for my work. I didn't have to put up an act because I don't really have a corporate look. I have like my piercings on my face and I wear big boots to work. But people were kind of accepting. And this was also around the same time that I had more female workers at the office. So it just loosened me up a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. It's nice that you're able to let your personality in and, loosen up a little bit. When you do that, did anything change? Did anything break or improve, in terms of your work or being at the workplace?
Yeah. I think the biggest shift was my mindset and my perspective. Obviously, like, I didn't have to put a lot of energy into maintaining a facade, per se. So I could put more effort into my work. But I also realized that people were a little bit more relaxed with me as well. And I remember like a time where, because when you're in like a war room with like 5 other engineers, right? And everything's like burning down, you want someone who can solve the problems, but you also want someone who can keep things calm, keep things in perspective, bring in a little humor, bring in a little human aspect to the situation. And I think that's really important in roles where things can seem very high stakes all the time.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, like for example,
Of course, we try to avoid being
yeah,
in the
for sure.
boardroom in the first place.
Because
But
that
when
is
you're
my job.
in it- but when you're in it, it helps to have different perspectives,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. Because
What's that like in your line of work?
because I feel, and this is not to dehumanize like the people I work with, but like a good toolbox isn't just full of screwdrivers, right? You'll need, for example, like when I worked on like a big project last year that you may be aware of and that you might be familiar with.
Okay.
I kind of saw this in action where like there was one person who was very comfortable being in a room of strangers and talking about very high concept things in a simplified way, and just being very confident about it. And that doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. There was also somebody who you might know very well,
Okay.
who gathered all of our queries and turned it into like a very pink dashboard.
Interesting.
Very interesting, that everyone ended up using. And like someone else, organized all of the information so that we could have something to refer to for the entire team. And you had somebody who took like all of these big picture tasks and put them in smaller chunks so that it's more manageable for people to do, so that one person doesn't burn out from doing like this one humongous task.
Yeah.
And I think these things really like grease the wheels in a good team, and it really helps in like the bigger picture. These are the things where when you have people who are naturally built that way, who don't like, because some people can argue that you can get a manager who can like assign all of these things to like, you organize the information and you go into rooms and present. But like when you have people who are naturally built that way, it inspires people. And also like it just makes sense in a bigger, like in the bigger picture of an organization, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Interesting that you mentioned that it's good when people are naturally built that way. They're naturally built to step up.
Yeah.
And I agree.
Exactly.
But I also think that it's something that we can encourage and cultivate. So
For sure.
I recently, that was a while ago, I read about Google's Project Aristotle.
Okay, tell me more.
It's a study that they did internally in Google about what makes a team effective at Google.
Right.
So through qualitative and quantitative analysis that they did, what they found out is that the most predicting factor is psychological safety.
Right.
So I know
That makes
that
sense.
this is an old study. It was done in 2015, and there's some
That's
views
not really
against
valid.
it
Okay.
because it's not, it's not peer reviewed, it's not published, and it's very specific to Google. But I kind of find some truth to it.
Yeah.
Like for me personally, based my own experience, when I was in a team that felt safer, I was more inclined to speak up. I was more inclined to share my ideas because I know that no one's going to judge me for sharing my own thoughts or, proposing
Right.
anything. But what's your take on it? Do you think that as someone who is responsible for keeping systems resilient, how important it is that people feel safe?
I think that, having psychological safety doesn't really mean lowering your standards.
Definitely.
It's not excusing mistakes. It's not letting people pijak kepala you, because that's what a lot of people tend to say. But when you get to know your team, when you get to know your people, you kind of develop like an internal barometer of when someone's taking advantage of you versus when someone is struggling. I think you can build that instinct, So I find that when people are comfortable with you, it just brings out better work, Yeah, so that's my take on it.
Okay. I also quite agree that those two can coexist, like high
yeah.
quality work and
And-
also safety.
yeah.
They're not
Mutually
mutually
exclusive.
exclusive.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to learn more about your experience.
Yeah.
Have you, relating to our previous question, have you seen situations where the lack of authenticity or safety has led to worse outcomes, where there's, missed warnings or avoidable incidents, things that we could avoid?
I think the thing that I keep seeing over and over again is when someone is really afraid to admit that they've made a mistake. And it's so cliche, but it's so important because these tiny things can really snowball into like a bigger issue. And I think you and I have personally seen it in effect in our line of work. And my proudest moment as someone who led a team is when like a team member of mine who had obviously made a mistake, at the end of the meeting, they just stood up and they apologized in front of everyone. And it takes like a certain kind of environment to feel safe enough to do that. Yeah, especially in like a room of your peers who you work with. But I think that's important. I think that's a muscle that you need to build, you know? So it's a muscle that you need to build, but it's also a culture that you need to cultivate. Yeah.
I feel that I can relate to that story because I know how scary it is to admit
it's
my
so
own
scary.
mistake whenever I
And
make
you don't
one.
want anyone to think you're dumb, right?
Yeah.
Especially in our line of work.
Yeah, but it has to be done because you have to, address it and then you solve the problem so that it doesn't snowball, and then, we fix it together and collectively we learn from it together. Okay, so we've talked about, different working environments. I think I myself, I've been very privileged to be in environments where I felt there was psychological safety, where I was encouraged to do things, I was encouraged to experiment. So in my own ways, I try to encourage, I make it a point to try and encourage others to do the same, where I think, or do it in my own little ways, where I think you can start small, like, or when you start doing something, or even when you're sharing an idea or you're sharing an article or a funny project or funny idea that you've created, it signals to others that they can do it too. And it tells people that, okay, this is something that I'm allowed to do. Or when I put things out, I'll be like, this is my thought, I might miss something, what do you think? And then it tells people that they can speak up, I suppose.
And that this is a place where you can do that and it's accepted.
Yes. So on that, as a lead yourself, what do you do, or what are some practical things that leaders could do to encourage psychological safety in their teams?
I think people need to embrace a little whimsy at work. And, you can just like have little doodles on the whiteboard, like the whiteboards that you use to to make diagrams, just make little tiny doodles, tiny quotes. We had like a famous words quote where we took like the silly things that our colleagues said and just put it on the wall for people to see. I've seen people put like plush toys and little knickknacks on their table, and I think that's just one way to be a little expressive at work. And I'm not talking about the end of the spectrum where you put like slides in the office and like
slides here,
slides,
like
slides,
playground slides,
like
right?
playground slides or hammocks. I'm talking little things like just like sharing articles that you think are fun that might not be even related to work, right? But it just signals that hey guys, like we can do work, but we can also have space for this other thing. There's this research or kind of like a psychological term, or I would say a psychological theory called incubation effect, where I think people know it intrinsically. So when you're trying to solve a problem, or let's say you're trying to write a book or whatever, right? It really helps, instead of just like drilling down on the task at hand for like 12 hours on end, pulling like an all-nighter, the incubation effect says that it really helps for you to get out of that context, for you to be able to efficiently solve it more. So for example, if you're doing some kind of really daunting task, it helps to like take a walk or maybe talk to someone about like dogs, for example, just to take your mind out of that context so that when you come back to it, your brain is just kind of a little bit more relaxed and prepared to solve that problem. And this is not something I came up with. This is a real like psychological effect that people can actually read up on. So yeah, I think having these spaces and having people who understand that space is sometimes required for good work is really important.
Do you remember our mental health
Oh yeah, we
walks
had
that
so many
did?
mental health walks to the grocery store. Yeah.
But also, that is from the perspective of, trying to cultivate a team.
Yeah.
But at the beginning, when you started working, right, or when I started working, I know that I was confused about how do I balance between learning the norms and then
Or being professional, as they like to say it.
trying to have my own voice.
Right.
So if you could give an advice to somebody who's starting out, what would you say?
I think the perspective has changed, and the atmosphere around like working has changed a lot since the pandemic. Because now a lot of people don't really work in office spaces. A lot of people are working remotely or in hybrid. So my advice might not really resonate as much anymore, but no matter what, I think you can try to slowly express yourself. So for example, if you're building a deck, like if you're building a pitch deck, you can just put little memes and see how people react, very low stake things like that, low stakes. You could even like put like a Pokemon card on your table, just so that it signals to people that you have this thing that you're interested in that they might want to talk to you about, So not things that are to the extreme if you're kind of afraid of showing that side of yourself. But start small. It's really easy to bring your personality in. Yeah. And also, like, I remember this one time I had brought up a conversation on movies at work.
Okay.
And I was so excited to talk about it. And it was just during lunch, a very casual thing. And everyone ignored me. So I think when you do things like that and it doesn't get reciprocated, it kind of tells you that this might not be the environment that you could thrive in. And it probably signals to you that, oh, maybe I should look for a place that, it's like an indicator to tell you whether this place fits you instead of the other way around. Yeah, because a lot of people try to fit the spaces that they put themselves in instead of trying to fit. Yeah.
Gel it together somehow.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's like, how people say sometimes work is work. It's true, but we spend a significant
much
portion of
time.
our hours and our time
Work,
either
especially as
doing it
Southeast
or
Asians.
thinking about it, right? And therefore, for me personally also, it is important that my work is reflective of my values.
Yeah. Sabrina, I don't think that it's a coincidence that a lot of top podcasts now are about self-help and that people are gravitating towards life coaching content. I think people really do want to work and live in a way that aligns with their values and their beliefs. And there's only so much you can gather from hiring someone who's great on paper, i.e. somebody who has like an amazing resume, but who doesn't have the skills that we were talking about just naturally built in them. And I also really think that these connections that you build at work kind of feed you in other ways more than work, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I really believe in cultivating relationships at work. I know that some people are like, oh, work is work, and like my personal life is my personal life. But like you said, we spend so much time in these places, in these spaces. So like, for example, I had someone who just joined our team, and she just brought up like offhand that she was a runner. So I just immediately caught that, and I started talking about her running journey, and we had an immediate conversation about running. And then I managed to connect her with someone else in our team who I knew was also getting into running. So now, in like a couple of months, we're running a 15K together.
Is it gonna be your first time?
It's gonna be my first 15K, not for the new joiner. She's like done 50K runs before, so yeah, so she's a pro. But I think these kind of connections are also important, apart from like connecting someone who is, let's say, very technical in like containers or like platforms or whatever, with someone who's like also doing the same thing, because that blend kind of helps people be comfortable before they start getting into the nitty gritty, right? Yeah.
I think I love that story.
Yeah.
Not the
Do you want to join us?
I don't like running.
Do you want to join our
Teach you how
15K?
to run, but not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
but-
really think people can build these instincts, you know?
Yeah.
It's like a social muscle. People talk so much about working out and getting those muscles built, but there's another point that I want to bring up, and it might not be related, but I think we've lost so much of that social muscle because we get our food delivered to us and like we're online most of the time, so we don't really get chances where we look someone like a stranger eye to eye and have a real conversation. So it's not just good for the work, but it's good for you as well.
I think so.
Yeah.
Especially in the
Yeah.
age where it's you know, it's very like.
Yeah, like you don't really go to cafes and bump into somebody anymore.
Yeah.
You know, everything's really planned. So these opportunities are really, really important as a society as well.
I think so.
Yeah, I know this is a little off topic, but I
that's
feel like
fine.
it's really important to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think relationship building and connecting with others, you know, it's important beyond the work. It's also because
Yeah.
we're humans first too.
Oh, for sure. Let's not
Especially-
forget that.
Yes, especially in this age of agents and everything. But yeah, I think
Cool.
with that, thank you very much, Emilia.
It's
I
so
think
nice being here.
I'm learning now about,
Yeah.
you know, that sometimes our personalities can be our strength.
Yeah.
And that sometimes
great way
I
of
feel
putting it.
I'm also getting that soft skills, they can be the hard skills sometimes, because
yeah.
they are the ones that are harder to master,
yeah.
maybe in some ways. But also they are what you need, especially as you go further up maybe. And that's it. Thank you very
Cool.
much.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. That was Emilia Zainudin. She works as a data resiliency lead at PayNet. I'm Sabrina Matzaid, and this is TikTok Talks. This podcast is recorded by...
I'm pulling like a teta.
Oh my God. This podcast is recorded by Ziad Zarin, Larry Lim, and Sarah Zari. Thank you.
Bye.